It's wrong to intentionally kill innocent human beings. Abortion does that. Therefore, it's wrong. We're making the same argument that Abraham Lincoln made on slavery. And Lincoln's point was there was no essential difference between the black man and the white man that justified enslaving the former. And we're making the same kind of argument here.
Welcome to the Alisa Childers podcast, where we equip Christians to identify the core beliefs of historic Christianity, discern its counterfeits, and proclaim the gospel with clarity, kindness, and truth. And you're going to want to take a moment and subscribe. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure you click that bell icon to be notified every time we release a new video, because we have some great videos and some great interviews coming up. Also, subscribe if you listen to your podcasts on Google or Spotify, iTunes. Leaving good reviews always helps us to get the message out to more people. I also want to let you know that we have some exclusive content that we have been producing on Instagram. So if you're not following on Instagram, head on over to Instagram at Alisa Childers. And I've been doing some sort of spontaneous live streams over on Instagram where I'll just take questions, but I always start with some topic that I'm going to discuss. Sometimes it's a skeptical meme that is making the rounds that relates to some of the things we talk about. And it's just been some great time of interaction and hangout time together over on Instagram. So definitely check that out. A couple of interviews we have coming up they're recorded live at the Southern Evangelical Seminary Annual Apologetics Conference that my husband and I recently traveled to. And so we set up a remote video podcast studio, and we're going to be doing more of that. So there'll be on location interviews from Kristen Davis, who is an SES girl. She's an Old Testament. That's what she specializes in, is Old Testament. So we talked for about an hour about the Old Testament reliability. That's something I haven't talked a ton about on this podcast, so you're definitely going to want to check that out. Also had a great conversation with Dr. H.C. Felder, so be looking for those. Those will be the next interviews we will put up, so be sure and subscribe. And today, I am so excited to bring you Scott Klusendorf, who travels throughout the United States and Canada. And what he does is he trains pro-life advocates to persuasively defend their views in the public square. So he contends that the pro-life message can compete in the marketplace of ideas if it's properly understood and properly articulated, because as many things we find in our culture, it is often strawmanned. There's often misconceptions about what people are really saying when they say they're pro-life. So he's the author of The Case for Life, Equipping Christians to Engage the Culture. And that was released in March 2009 on Crossway Books. And he co-authored the book Stand for Life, which was released in December 2012. He's got articles published in Pro-Life Apologetics at the Christian Research Journal, Clear Thinking, Focus on the Family, Citizen, and the Conservative Theological Journal. So I've invited Scott today to talk about what he thinks are the top objections to pro-life arguments. In other words, if you say something on social media about being pro-life, what are the things people are going to say to push back on what you're saying? Here's how you can be prepared to answer some of that. And also, what are the pro-abortion ideas that you need to be prepared to interact with? So, man, Scott, so great. We finally made this happen. We've tried to record this episode a couple times, but it finally worked out.
Great to be with you, Alisa.
Well, awesome. So I'd love it if we could just start, for anybody who maybe they just haven't thought this issue through very deeply. Maybe they know deep down that they're against abortion or that they're pro-life. Can you just begin by laying the foundation of giving us a quick case for what is the case for pro-life?
Yeah, let me give you the basic syllogism, and listeners don't need to freak out over that word. It just means two premises followed by a conclusion. There's actually a pro-life argument that we make, and it's vitally important that all people who support the pro-life position, and even those who don't, at least understand what the basic argument is. So here it is. Premise one, it's wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being. Premise two, abortion, intentionally kills an innocent human being. Conclusion, therefore abortion is wrong. It's wrong to intentionally kill innocent human beings. Abortion does that. Therefore, it's wrong. Now, you can notice right away, Alisa, that is an argument that can only be defeated one of three ways. You can show that it's unsound, meaning that one or more of the premises are untrue, or you can show that it's not valid, meaning the conclusion doesn't follow logically, or you can show that the terms are used in an unclear manner. Outside of that, the argument stands. Now, why is that important? Here's why. When it comes to abortion, a lot of times what people do is what they do in marriage when they're losing an argument. They change the subject. Now, I know mature people like you and me never do that when we're in arguments with our spouses. But when it comes to issues like abortion, what tends to happen is if you make a case for your view and your critic is not prepared to engage the actual argument, he or she may change the subject on you. So when it comes to abortion, instead of engaging that argument that I just laid out, you'll hear people talk about choice, privacy. Why do you hate women? Why don't you trust women? Why do you want to force your moral views on others? These objections are not serious objections. Now, I am not saying there are no substantial arguments against my position. There certainly are. I don't think they work, but I wouldn't for a moment say that only a foolish person would hold a position different than my own. But there are some very foolish responses, and the ones I just mentioned are not serious responses to that argument that I just laid out.
That's good. And today we're going to talk through 6 responses that someone might get. Like if they go on and they make the logical claim, here's the syllogism, here's what we think. There are 6 pushbacks that we're going to teach people today to be able to interact with. And so those are, number 1, that pro-life is a religious view. In other words, people saying, oh, that's just your religion. Don't push your religion on me, something like that. Number 2 would be some iteration of the idea that, if we don't make abortion legal, if it doesn't stay legal, then women are going to die in back alleys, something along those lines. Number 3, the unborn are human, but not persons. And I suspect this is probably the one that's going to be the most interacted with in the public square right now, is my guess. Number 4, the Bible, this is the pushback, the Bible nowhere condemns abortion or even mentions it. That's actually from the Freedom from Religion. So the idea would be that the science, we'll get to all this. I don't want to get too deep in the weeds of it. And number 5, that abortion is morally complex, that somehow that this is a really complicated issue, so we can't make black and white statements about it. And number 6, and this I was going to ask you about too, the idea that men can't speak about abortion, and here you are, a man, making your case. I would imagine, do you have to engage with that one quite a bit, I would guess?
I do. Of course, if I were to be snarky, I could always fire back and say, well, how do you know that I'm a man? But of course, I wouldn't recommend doing that.
Because you're not a biologist, right? You're not a biologist.
That's right. Who am I to say what a man is? But in reality, you're right. That is one of the most popular pushbacks, and it is completely beside the point, as I'm sure we'll talk about. And you're right to identify those 6 areas as being the big points. I would add one other thing to my syllogism that we started with, and that is that pro-lifers actually defend that syllogism. We don't defend it with religion. We defend it with philosophy. We defend it with science. So let's, in a minute or less, defend that syllogism. Here it is. We argue from science that the unborn are distinct, living, and whole human beings. They're not part of another human being like these skin cells on the back of my hand. Rather, they are themselves whole living entities from the one cell stage. That's our scientific case, which is backed up, as you know, Alisa, in every embryology textbook in the universe. We then argue philosophically that there's no essential difference between Alisa the embryo and Alisa the adult that would justify killing her at that earlier stage of development. Yes, there are differences, but the question is, do those differences matter such that we can say it's okay to kill you then, but not now? And when we look at those differences, you can boil them down to 4: size, level of development, environment, meaning where you're located, and degree of dependency. You can use the acronym SLED, S-L-E-D, to remember these four differences. Size, there's your S. You were certainly smaller as an embryo, but since when does body size determine your value? 7'2" Shaquille O'Neal, the basketball star who formerly played with the Lakers, is a foot taller than you and I, but he's not more human and valuable just because he's bigger. What about level of development? There's your L in that SLED acronym. You and I were less developed as embryos. So why does that matter? 2-year-old girls are less developed than 21-year-old young women. 2-year-old girls do not have developed reproductive systems yet. Are they less human and valuable than the 21-year-old who does? Environment, meaning where we're located. You were in the womb, now you're out. But how does where you are change what you are? If a journey of 70 feet from, I'm making a guess about your studio here, from your living room area to your recording studio did not change you from one kind of thing to another, how does a journey of 7 inches down the birth canal change you from something we can intentionally kill to a human being we cannot? And of course, the obvious answer is if you weren't human and valuable to begin with, you don't get there just by changing your location. And finally, degree of dependency. Sure, you depended on your mother for survival, but again, why does that matter? And this is key, Alisa. We have to ask our critics, and gently, I'm not trying to be snarky here, but it's not enough to simply say, oh, there's a difference between you, the embryo, and you, the adult. You've got to tell me why that difference is value giving. Why does it matter in the first place? And it's not enough to just cite a difference. So yes, you did depend on your mother for survival. But why should I believe that dependency on another human being means I can kill you? Conjoined twins depend on each other's bodily systems. We don't slit their throats because they can't live independent of one another. So if you think of size, level of development, environment, degree of dependency, remember SLED. You can remember these differences and they're morally insignificant. They have no bearing on whether we can intentionally kill you.
It's interesting, as a mother, I'm just thinking about when I first had my daughter. I mean, she was entirely dependent on me outside the womb, even at 3 months old, 5 months old. A year-old babies are completely dependent upon their mothers. And in the culture might say, well, you know, they might even be okay with, sadly and horrifically in my view, they might be okay with killing a child, at birth or something. But pretty much nobody's like, yeah, it's okay to kill a 3-month-old or a 5-month-old. But as far as location and dependency, they're in a different location, but they're just as dependent as they were when they were inside the body. So it seems like that it just seems like such a common sense case, doesn't it?
It does. And by the way, we're making the same argument that Abraham Lincoln made on slavery.
Wow.
Lincoln's critics would say, hey, listen, that black man differs from us. He's not like us. And Lincoln, to paraphrase Lincoln, he'd say, you're right, he isn't. He is different from us, but that's the wrong question. The question is he different from us in ways that justify enslaving him? And to cite Lincoln almost word for word, here's how he replied. He said, quote, you say man A is white, man B is dark. Oh, it is skin color then, the fair-skinned man having the right to enslave the dark-skinned man? Take care, by that rule, you're a slave to the first person you meet with skin fairer than your own. You say it's not skin color, it's a matter of intelligence. The white man you allege has superior intellect to the dark man. Take care again. By that rule, you're a slave to the first person with an intellect superior to yours. You say it's not skin color, it's not intellect, it's a matter of interest. The white man having it in his interest to enslave the dark man. Take care yet again. By that rule, you're a slave to the first person you meet who can make it his interest to enslave you, end quote. Now, I think you see what Lincoln did there. The very arguments that are used to justify enslaving the dark man worked real well for a whole lot of whites that were walking around as free creatures. And Lincoln's point was there was no essential difference between the black man and the white man that justified enslaving the former. And we're making the same kind of argument here. And by the way, it's not just pro-lifers who make it. Peter Singer, the ethicist at Princeton University, who argues that no newborn should be considered a person until 30 days after birth, and that newborns can be killed on the spot if it suits the preferences of the parents, he is at least consistent. He says, look, fetus is not self-aware, newborn is not self-aware. you can kill both. And he's right. Neither is self-aware. Neither has a sense of themselves existing over time. They don't view themselves as ontologically different than their mothers. Yeah, they cry, poop, and, yell. But beyond that, there's not a whole lot to commend a newborn or a fetus to us in terms of its functional abilities. And Singer rightly says, you cannot draw this arbitrary line at birth and spare the newborn while you say it's perfectly fine to kill the fetus.
Mm. So obviously we're both Christians. You're a Christian. I'm a Christian. We would have a lot to say about what Christianity would say about this, and even what the Bible has to say about it. I don't know how you would word it. I would probably word it something like, the Bible is the ultimate standard for truth, of course. But I think there's some confusion in there, maybe some gray area where people think, oh, well, you guys are just taking your Bible and you're trying to impose your religious beliefs on other people. Now, Scott, I imagine, like me, you would view the Bible as being correct on these things. But what you're saying is that to be pro-life, you don't even have to be a Christian to be pro-life. Right. We're not necessarily saying that because we believe that this is what the Bible says, that everyone else has to obey that. We're actually saying it's much more than that. So one of the pushbacks, let's just dive right into these pushbacks. Sure. So the first one would be, let's say you're trying to make this case in the public square, and someone comes along and says, well, hey, I'm an agnostic. I don't have to do what your Bible says. And pro-life, like this is just what a bunch of Christians are saying. That's just a pro-life religious view. How would you interact with that objection?
Well, let's start with the claim that the pro-life view is a religious argument. This is a dodge, not a refutation, and I'll explain why. Arguments, as we mentioned a moment ago, are either valid or invalid, sound or unsound. Calling an argument religious is a category error, like saying, how tall is the number 3? You've got to do the actual hard work of refuting the argument by showing it doesn't follow, that one or more of the premises is untrue. And outside of that, the argument, you are obliged to submit to it by the force of reasoning. And what people do, instead of doing that difficult work of refuting the argument, they call it a name. Oh, it's religious. Oh, that's just a man's perspective. Oh, that's just you wanting to force a view on others. That's not a refutation. You've got to show where the argument goes wrong. And by the way, a lot of things have religious roots to them, but we don't toss them out as irrational. Lincoln's second inaugural address, for example, the Declaration of Independence, Martin Luther King's letter from the Birmingham jail, all have their roots in the theistic concept of the Imago Dei. Do we trash those as being somehow irrational just because they have a religious foundation? The truth is, Alisa, that everybody in this debate is doing religion. Everybody is bringing metaphysical presuppositions to the table. And I love it when people try to pretend they're not. Look, both sides of this debate are making metaphysical claims. The pro-life side is claiming that each and every human being has value simply because of its humanity, simply because we're humans. The other side says, no, being human is not enough. What you have to have are functional abilities you can immediately exercise, something like self-awareness or sentience or something of that nature. Notice, though, that both sides are making metaphysical claims answering the same exact question: what makes humans valuable in the first place? That question is inherently religious, it is inherently metaphysical, and anybody who pretends it's not is living in a dream world. Now, having said that, if the pro-life side, or I should say, if the pro-choice side should not be dismissed for its ties to metaphysics, neither should the pro-life side be dismissed for its ties to metaphysics. That said, though, pro-lifers can make an argument that is not overtly religious, that non-Christians can recognize. And here's where I think some Christians, Alisa, get it wrong. They think that unbelievers can't recognize moral arguments simply because they have difficulty grounding them ontologically. Look, I agree. Non-believers, a non-theist, is going to have a hard time explaining to me the basis for morality, the basis for human dignity and human rights and moral obligations. Look, Objective moral rules require an objective moral lawgiver. Intrinsic human dignity requires somebody who bestows that dignity. That much is clear. But it doesn't follow that non-believers can't recognize certain moral truths, like rape is wrong, murder is wrong, you shouldn't torture toddlers for fun. In fact, I work with a group, I'm not employed by them, but I've assisted them, secular pro-life. They are largely atheists, but I can help them with pro-life apologetics, and their arguments resonate with people who don't share our worldview. So people who try to dodge this on the basis of religion are not doing enough to refute the pro-life argument. They're simply, really, to be honest, dodging the issue.
And that seems to be so characteristic of meme culture, because like, I'm listening to you talk and I'm just marveling the solid logic, the common sense, the grounding of everything you're saying in a solid philosophical base. And I'm just thinking, you know, most people would probably hear that and just be like, whatever, I saw this meme last week that pointed out how dumb Christians are or something.
Right.
And I think that's almost like, that's half the battle, isn't it? Is how to make people care that we're actually making a solid philosophical case here. Have you come across that? And I wonder how do you interact with that meme culture that just doesn't have more than an 8-second attention span to hear the solid philosophical case we're trying to build?
Oh, that's so important. I'm really glad you brought this up. Look, there are times we have to change how people feel about abortion as a predicate to changing how they think and ultimately behave on it. And this is where visual imagery on abortion is so crucial to our case. We don't use pictures of abortion in place of good arguments. We use them as valuable adjuncts to good arguments. I'll bet that 90% of the people watching us right now paid money to go watch gruesome imagery on the screen. They went and saw movies like Schindler's List, The Passion of the Christ, Hacksaw Ridge, Saving Private Ryan. I mean, I saw all those movies. I paid money, took my kids to see those movies when they were old enough. Why? Because those images in those films convey truth in a way that no words can. They speak to us at a very deep and visceral level. And again, not in place of solid reasons, but they get past those who will throw roadblocks up to solid reasons. And it helps speak directly to the heart of the person before you address their mind. And this is actually a very solid technique to use. Going back to the Civil War, Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist, would say to people like Abraham Lincoln, Mr. President, your arguments on behalf of the slave are rock solid. The logic is tight. Nobody can refute them. But here's the problem. The nation is yawning. It doesn't care. What we have to do, Mr. President, is reawaken the moral imagination of the nation. And it wasn't long after that federal forces in northern states began circulating slavery pictures, the earliest photographs we have, actually. And you've seen them, the one where there's the African man with the scar just running all the way down his back. These images inflame the conscience of northern citizens, and it literally shifted the focus of the Civil War from a states issue to a moral issue about slavery. And that is why pro-lifers use imagery in conjunction with good arguments to change how people feel. So when we get that snarky millennial who says to us, oh, I saw a meme last week that defeats your whole case, we can play that game too, only we're doing it truthfully. We're actually submitting the evidence. A colleague of mine, Greg Cunningham, puts it so well. He says, when you show pictures of abortion, abortion protests itself. And that's really true. That's why we use it when we speak. We use it carefully. We don't just spring them on people, but I use them in my debates. I use them in my church presentations and at worldview forums because of the way they change how people feel as the predicate to changing how they think.
That's such an important point, because I remember even as a very young child, I don't know quite how old I was when I first saw pictures, and I've actually even shared on the podcast before that as a very young child, so this goes way back. I know you're familiar with my dad's music, and this goes way back to somewhere in the 80s. And I could be getting some of these details wrong because it's been such a long time, but there was a sort of, remember that We Are the World that the world did?
Yes.
There was an anti-abortion version of that a bunch of Christian artists came together. My dad was a part of that.
Yes, he was.
Yes, and I got to come to the taping of that. So I'm in the video as a little girl, like in the front. You can see me.
I'm going to look that up when we're done here.
Yeah, I know. I don't know if it's on YouTube somewhere, but I'm there
It is.
singing.
I remember seeing it. Yeah.
Good.
Melody Green put this together.
That's right.
Yes.
I remember
widow,
that day very, very clearly. That was the day, Scott, that I knew that abortion was morally evil. And that's because, and my memories are a little fuzzy on this, but at the time, I think it had to do with baby choice and President Reagan. They were trying to get a burial for baby choice. So they had literally there, physically, it was either baby choice or some another aborted child was literally there. And you could view it. And Scott, it was one of I'm sure my parents, that was probably a tough call for them to decide whether or not to let me see that. It's the best choice they ever made because I looked at that body and I knew as a young child, that is a human being. That is a deceased human being. And it lit a fire in me that I've never questioned whether or not abortion. I didn't need arguments. And so I just want to support what you're saying there as far as the visuals and in my case, actually being in the same room with to be able to see what this actually looks like is one of the most powerful apologetics. And we live in a time when we're so visual, we have social media, we have lots of different creative ways to be able to show people the actual reality of what this really is. So that's a powerful point. And speaking to, to appealing to people's emotions, and we'll go on to pushback number 2 now. And that is that some iteration of the idea that women will die in back alleys if abortion becomes illegal. And so I was trying to see how this might, so we've heard things like that for a long time. And I was looking for an article to help me understand how that might be articulated today. So I found an article on The Guardian. And this is a direct quote from the article. It said, if Roe v. Wade were to be overturned, at least 26 states hostile to abortion would outlaw abortion either immediately or as quickly as possible, according to the Guttmacher Institute, a pro-choice research organization. Abortion advocates believe this would probably result in desperate people who have the resources seeking abortions in more liberal states. However, most people are unlikely to make that long, expensive, and arduous journey. Campaigners warn that poor, young, and people of color are far more likely to turn to illegal methods. And then, of course, it extrapolates on to talk about that those are going to be more dangerous methods and they're going to put the lives of the mothers in danger. So, and that's just a recent article on The Guardian of talking about what the reality will be for women if this happens. And it's really an iteration of that idea that women are going to die in back alleys if abortion is illegal through, illegal means. And so I'm sure you've thought quite a bit about that. How would you respond if somebody read you that quote and said, hey, what do you have to say to that?
The first thing I tell pro-lifers when somebody brings up the dangers of illegal abortions is you need to show empathy. Too often what pro-lifers do, they jump right to statistics. And by the way, our statistics on this are correct. So it's not that our math is wrong. It's that our initial approach is wrong. If you really want to win the person and give them something to think about, when they bring up a woman dying from an illegal abortion, our first reaction should be empathy. That's a tragedy. We mourn the loss of any woman who dies from an abortion, legal or illegal. So the first thing I always say is, you know what? You and I at least have common ground that we mourn her death. It's a tragedy. Then I want to gently expose the assumption of the argument. It's actually what we call a question-begging argument. It assumes the very thing it's trying to prove. Notice that the argument from the dangers of illegal abortion assumes the unborn are not human. Because otherwise, Alisa, what this argument is saying is that because some people will die attempting to intentionally kill other innocent human people, we ought to make it legal and safe for them to do it. But wait a minute, why should the law be faulted for making it more risky for one human to intentionally kill another completely innocent one? We certainly don't make bank robbery legal so that it can be safer for felons. We don't do that in anywhere in our legal system at all. We recognize the need to protect innocent human beings. So if the unborn are human, this argument really has a shaky foundation. So we're back to the real question here that matters. What is the unborn? That's the real issue. We would never kill 2-year-olds because it would be safer to kill 2-year-olds than it would be to kill a younger child. I mean, nobody would make that argument, but they do this with abortion because they assume the unborn are not human. Then I finally jump to the numbers side of it. After I've shown empathy, after I've exposed the question-begging assumption that the unborn are not human, I then point out that it's simply untrue that women died in large number from illegal abortion prior to Roe v. Wade. Now, did some women die? Yes. Pro-lifers who run around and say, oh, there were hardly any deaths. That's not true. Of course there were. But 5,000 to 10,000 a year, as is commonly claimed, not a chance. And to back that up, I'm going to briefly mention 4 pro-abortion sources, not a single pro-life one. So pro-abortion source number 1, Dr. Mary Calderon, the former medical director for Planned Parenthood in the 1960s, when allegedly all these illegal abortions were taking place that were killing all these women. She said in an American Journal of Public Health article that the vast majority of illegal abortions, 90% of them are not performed by guys with rusty coat hangers in the back alleys of America. They are performed by doctors in good standing in the community who simply cheat the law. The second thing she said was that the death rate from illegal abortion was so low, it wasn't even worth commenting on. What made it so low? She said, again, this is not my words. These are the words of Planned Parenthood's medical director. She said what made the rate so low was that the widespread introduction of penicillin had made all surgical procedures far more safe than they had been in the decades past. And therefore, the post-operation infection rate had plummeted to near zero, including post-op infections from abortion. So we've got Planned Parenthood, source number 1. Source number 2, Christopher Tietz, Planned Parenthood statistician in the 60s and 70s, called the claim of 5,000 to 10,000 deaths a year from illegal abortion, quote, unmitigated nonsense, unquote. Again, that's not a pro-lifer, that's Planned Parenthood stat guy. Third source, Dr. Daniel Callahan of the Hastings Institute, who wrote the book Abortion, Law, Morality, and Choice, called the claim of 5,000 to 10,000 deaths a year absolutely absurd, and here's why. 40,000 women of reproductive age die from all causes in the U.S. annually. To claim as high a number as 5,000 to 10,000 comes from a single source, illegal abortion, stretches credulity to the breaking point, he said. And finally, Bernard Nathanson, co-founder of NARAL, while he was still in that role, was very candid that they fed the idea of 5,000 to 10,000 deaths a year to a sympathetic media after making it up out of thin air. They just fed it to the press and the press bought it. So again, there weren't 5,000 to 10,000 deaths a year. Were there some? Yes. Were those deaths a tragedy? Yes. But 5,000 to 10,000 a year, that's nonsense.
I would imagine that this could be very compelling to our culture because we are living in a time where it's not difficult at all to imagine making things up and the media buying it. I mean, we're living in a time where that's just not that uncommon. So, you know, somebody could just look around and say, this is very, very likely to happen. You know, it's very plausible.
Indeed. And you're right. It's a real risk. Now, let me give you a contemporary example. In Texas, abortion has been, for the most part, de facto illegal for the last 6 months. The court has let stand the Texas law. And how many women have died in Texas from illegal abortions? We don't have any accounting of any. It simply has not happened. And so right there, we've got a contemporary example. Here's what happens. Most women are going to follow the law. The law is a moral teacher. This goes right back to an Aristotelian concept. The law tends to function as a moral tutor. And what a lot of, I think, Christians get wrong too, they think that laws really have no value. We've got to change everyone's heart before a law can be effective. Well, that's nonsense. I'll give you another example. In the early 60s, prior to the 1964 Civil Rights Act, a majority of Southerners opposed civil rights for blacks. Within 2 years of that law becoming official, the majority of Southerners supported full civil rights for blacks. What happened during that time? The law changed, and the law tends to underscore how people behave. Now, Will some people skirt the law? Of course. But laws against rape don't stop all rape, but we don't legalize rape.
Right.
Laws against spousal abuse don't make that go away completely, but it stops most. And the same would be true with abortion. And you cited something very important a moment ago, and that is we've got solid research showing that most women will not travel to go get abortions in other states. They're going to stay where they're at. Now, from that, our opponents are jumping to the conclusion, well, that means they're automatically going to go get back alley abortions. Well, that's not what's happening in Texas. So I think their argument is on shaky ground.
And it also seems, do you think that's why when Roe v. Wade became legal, do you think that's why so many people became okay with abortion? Like it's sort of following your logic, but on the opposite.
Yes.
Because I don't know the statistics on it, but were that many Americans really pro-abortion before that point?
Well, I think it had a huge effect, and we know it had a huge effect on the rate of abortion because prior to Roe v. Wade, the most liberal estimates, and I'll go with a liberal estimate here, not a conservative one, was that there were roughly 350 to maybe 375,000 illegal abortions a year in the U.S. Within 6 years of Roe v. Wade, we were at 1.5 million a year. So the law clearly did make a difference in how people viewed the permissibility of abortion. I think that, too, it has an effect on public opinion. People mistakenly today think if it's legal, it's right. And they forget that slavery was once legal. They forget that segregation was once legal. And they somehow think, well, there's no higher authority than the law. Well, this is, of course, something that flows naturally from the breakdown of a biblical worldview. A biblical worldview says, no, God is the source of all good, all the moral order, that right and wrong are grounded in his righteous character. Without a transcendent grounding point, all you have is what's legal. And so a lot of people, having jettisoned the biblical worldview, are left kind of in a vacuous place with nowhere to ground their moral rules outside the Supreme Court.
All right, let's move to number 3 here. The pushback would be, well, the unborn aren't people yet. And it seems like it used to be that people were arguing the science. They're saying, well, scientifically, an embryo is not a person. It's just a clump of cells or this or that. But the science seems pretty solid that an unborn human is alive and that it is human. So do you see that the debate has kind of gone over to the personhood debate? And how would you respond to somebody who would come to what you were saying and saying, well, you know, I agree with you that we shouldn't kill people, but the unborn's just clump cells. They're not actually persons.
Well, when anybody says to me, the unborn are human, but they're not persons, the first things out of my mouth are, what's the difference? Have you ever met a human that wasn't a person? Now, listeners that have teenagers may be saying, wait a minute, I have one in my house. But outside of that, you get the idea. Look, why should we believe there can be such a thing as a human who's not a person? And it's important for pro-lifers to recognize who has the burden of proof at this point. They're making the claim there can be such a thing as a human that's not a person. They've got to prove that claim. It's not on me to refute it. They need to do the hard work of making their claim persuasive. But that view that the unborn are human but not persons divides humanity into two classes. Human beings that have a right to life, that are persons that we can't kill, and over here another class of human beings that are human but they're not persons, therefore we can intentionally kill them. And basically what they end up doing is saying, well, the unborn don't count because they lack a certain cognitive property that they are able to exercise immediately, something like self-awareness or maybe the ability to feel pain. I mean, the arbitrary nature of what they pick out can be all over the map. But let's just take self-awareness, for example, since it tends to be the most common one. Well, the first thing I want to ask is, why is that value giving and not something else? Why is it self-awareness and not, say, having a belly button that points out rather than in? Why should I see self-awareness as being decisive? They need to argue for that, not merely assert it. But secondly, the argument is going to prove way more than most abortion advocates want it to prove, because it's going to disqualify newborns. And now the latest research that's coming out suggests that full self-awareness, full self-identity isn't really there in the child until about age 2. So we're now talking about killing toddlers by that argument. So they're going to pay a real high price holding that view. But thirdly, Alisa, This argument has savage implications for human equality.
Mm.
If self-awareness is what gives us our value, and you have more of it than me, then you have a greater right to life than me, and human equality is out the window. Christians have a much more solid basis for human equality. We're not equal because of properties that may come and go, like self-awareness or viability or the ability to feel pain. We're not valuable because of those things, which, by the way, we don't share equally. We're valuable because we share the same human nature, which as Christians, we know bears the image of our Maker. But that human nature does not come in degrees. You either have it or you don't. And when did you get your human nature? Answer: the moment you began to be. When did you begin to be? Fertilization from the one cell stage. Now, there is a worldview idling behind this idea that there could be such a thing as a human that's not a person. And I think pro-life Christians often do themselves a disservice by not addressing that worldview. That worldview is known as body-self dualism. And body-self dualism says that you, Alisa, have nothing to do with your physical body. Your physical body has nothing to do with your identity whatsoever. The real you is your cognitive self, your aims, your desires, your thoughts, your feelings. And that is why in today's culture, people will say, well, I'm a man trapped in a woman's body, or something of that nature. They'll think that their body tells them nothing about their identity, nothing about their moral obligations, only their cognitive self does. And that bifurcation of the human person, separating it from body and self, is what leads to these arguments that say we can have a class of human beings over here we can't kill, but another class over here we can kill, who are cognitively not persons yet. But this, again, just leads to savage inequality. And I think the biggest problem, why should we accept that these properties that people arbitrarily pick out as being important, why should we accept them as being decisive? They need to present an argument for that. Marianne Warren doesn't present an argument for it. I don't think Peter Singer does. Michael Tooley certainly doesn't. And this is something they need to argue for.
And this is something I think a lot of Christians have sort of fallen for, this body-mind dualism. There's a famous quote that's attributed to C.S. Lewis. I'm fairly certain he didn't actually say it, but it's the famous quote that says, you are a soul, you have a body, and that separates, what it really means to be human according to that type of thinking is your immaterial, the immaterial aspect of you. But
exactly. And as Christians, we do hold to dualism. I'm not trashing dualism in total, just body-self dualism.
Body-self,
we hold the body-soul dualism, that human beings are a dynamic union of body and soul. And if you think about the way the Christian worldview thinks of the soul, it's not like water filling a glass. If you imagine a clear glass with water in it, that's more the Cartesian view. The Christian worldview is that body and soul are entwined. They are infused. We are a dynamic union of body and soul. And our bodies matter in the Christian worldview. And some Christians have bought this Gnostic view that somehow the body is intrinsically evil. No, the sins that come from it may be, but God made the body. God made the body as part of what it means to reflect his image. And Christians should not be leading the charge of trashing the body. And a lot of them do that. And that's part of what's driving this narrative about that you can be something other than your body. And until you have a cognitive self, you're not really there. I mean, Peter Singer, Michael Tooley, Jubilini, Minerva, all these thinkers argue basically that you weren't even born. You weren't there when you were born, Alisa. You didn't really show up until quite a few months later, actually, which means your body shows up waiting for yourself to kind of float in at some point, I guess. It leads to absurd consequences. I'll just give you one more absurd consequence. Your viewers right now, as they're looking at this, maybe they can see a bookcase behind me. I don't know that for a fact, but there is a bookcase behind me. As they look at that bookcase, their physical eye is making contact with it and is seeing it, but their immaterial mind is making sense of what they see. And here we see evidence of body and soul working together. We are a dynamic union of body and soul. The act of seeing involves both the physical and the non-physical. We don't segregate them out the way that body-self dualism does.
Right. So for clarity, what we're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, because I want to understand it and try to simplify in a way that I can articulate it back to you. So what we're saying is the humanity, the thing that makes us human, the thing that makes us a self, is not just the immaterial. It's the immaterial aspect of us and the body together that make us human, right? Rather than the idea that we are this immaterial thing and we just kind of get a body that just is there, or some people might think intrinsically evil. Is that a fair characterization of what we're saying?
Yeah.
There?
On the non-Christian worldview here that we're talking about, the body is just mere matter. I can manipulate it any way I want. On the Christian worldview, my body is to be given in sacrificial obedience to the Lord's way of doing things. I'm to present my body as a living sacrifice. That's what it means to be a follower of Christ. So Christians do not buy the bifurcation of the human body and the human self. We do believe in a dynamic union of body and soul. And yes, the soul will survive the death of the body until it's reunited with a body later. But isn't it interesting, when Christ restores the world fully, he's going to restore our bodies. If our bodies didn't matter, why would he do that? So on the Christian worldview, we got to be very careful we don't throw the body under the bus.
That's right. We're not going to be these disembodied souls floating around throughout eternity. We will have a body. Very good. All right, number 4, this pushback here would say, well, hey, the Bible doesn't even condemn abortion. It doesn't even mention abortion. And I mentioned earlier when I was introducing the concepts that I found this on the Freedom from Religion website. And this has got a meme here of Adam and Eve. And it says, what does the Bible say about abortion? Absolutely nothing. I'm reading from the Freedom from Religion website here. It says, the word abortion does not appear in any translation of the Bible. Out of more than 600 laws of Moses, none comments on abortion. One Mosaic law about miscarriage specifically contradicts the claim that the Bible is anti-abortion, clearly stating that miscarriage does not involve the death of a human being. If a woman has a miscarriage as the result of a fight, the man who caused it should be fined. If the woman dies, however, the culprit must be killed. And then they reference Exodus 21. That is where they're getting that, where it says, if men strive and hurt a woman with child so that her fruit depart from her, and yet no mischief follow, he shall surely be punished according as the woman's husband will lay upon him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. And if any mischief follow, then thou shalt give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. And then the commentary closes with, the Bible orders the death penalty for murder of a human being, but not for the expulsion of a fetus. So they're actually saying, not only does the Bible not condone it or even mention it, the only verse we can find that even would address something like it seems to say that abortion is perfectly morally fine.
Yeah. Well, whenever somebody says to me, the Bible nowhere condemns abortion, my first question is this: are you saying whatever the Bible does not expressly condemn, it allows?
Right.
Where in the Bible does it say, thou shalt not use neighbor for shark bait? It's not there. So if we're going to play the game that something has to be expressly condemned before we can make a biblical case against it, that's a pretty shaky place to build your intellectual foundation. But let's go ahead and ask what we can do about discerning the Bible's intent on abortion. And so I'm going to concede 2 things right here. For the sake of argument, I'm going to concede that nowhere does the Bible condemn abortion. Secondly, I'm going to concede that nowhere does the Bible expressly teach the unborn are human. And I'm going to argue the Bible is pro-life anyway, and here's how I know. Premise 1, the Bible teaches that all humans have value because they bear the image of God. Genesis 1 teaches that in the Old Covenant. James 3 teaches it in the New. Premise 2, because all humans bear the image of God, the shedding of innocent blood, meaning the intentional killing of an innocent human being, is strictly forbidden. Exodus 23:7 teaches this. Proverbs 6:16-19 teaches this. Matthew 5 teaches this. All right, let's take just those 2 premises. The shedding of innocent blood is forbidden because all humans bear the image of God. From that, there's only one question we need to ask: are the unborn human? And the science of embryology is very clear that from the earliest stages of development, from the one cell stage, you were a distinct, living, whole human being. Therefore, the commands in Scripture that forbid the shedding of innocent blood for other humans apply to the unborn just like they do everyone else. Now, that's a pretty solid argument that's very tough to dislodge. But let's go ahead and jump to Exodus 21, that passage that they bring up to try to show that the Bible actually supports abortion. In that context, two dudes are duking it out, and a woman's standing by who's pregnant, and they inadvertently collide with her, provoking a miscarriage. That's the context. So here's my question. How does it follow that because there's a lesser penalty for unintentionally triggering a miscarriage, that we may intentionally abort? This is a gigantic non sequitur. It simply doesn't follow that because there's a lesser penalty for accidentally triggering a miscarriage, that we may intentionally provoke an abortion. There's no linkage here to abortion whatsoever. This is reading into the passage an entirely foreign context that isn't there. But secondly, the passage doesn't prove what critics think it does. Let's go ahead and say they're right, that there is a lesser penalty for harming the fetus than harming the mother. In a minute, I'll show you why that's not true, but let's accept it for the moment. That same passage, just a few verses later, presents a situation where a master unintentionally harms his slave, and the slave eventually dies from his injuries, and there's no penalty at all. Does it follow that the slave is not fully human? I mean, this passage just doesn't do the work that they need it to do. They're just bringing a foreign meaning into it that they hope to project out from it. But thirdly, Alisa, most reliable translations of that passage are very clear that the lex talionis, the law of retribution, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, life for life, apply equally to the child as they do the mother. It's only versions like the Jerusalem Bible, the original Revised Standard Bible, which have since been largely discredited, that translate the passage that way. So I just don't believe Exodus 21 is a good way to argue for abortion at all.
All right, let's go to number 5, the idea that abortion is morally complicated. If somebody comes around saying, hey, I think we should not have abortions, and they say, well, it's complicated. There's a lot of moral, ups and downs that we have to consider. How might you respond to that pushback?
Well, I think people confuse psychological complexity with moral complexity. For example, Alisa, if you and I were in church one Sunday and we learned of a 14-year-old girl in the youth group who was pregnant, her boyfriend is going to dump her, her parents, who are deacons in the church, don't know what to do. She doesn't appear to have a lot of support, and we fully understand that this is going to have a major impact on her life. Do we feel sympathy for her? Well, yes, we do. Do we feel compassion? Well, of course we do. But it doesn't follow that because we feel sympathy that no moral truths apply here. And the question is simply this: can we kill the unborn? And here's my answer: yes. If what? If the unborn are not human. I'm vigorously pro-choice on women choosing their own husbands, choosing their own worldviews, choosing their own religion, choosing their own healthcare provider, choosing the cars they want to drive unless they're Priuses. I'm pro-choice on a lot of issues. But intentionally killing an innocent human being is not something a civil society allows. We shouldn't allow that particular choice. But before we can answer the question, can we kill the unborn, we've got to answer the question, what is the unborn? Nobody argues about choice and who decides if we were talking about killing 2-year-olds. They only argue that way about the unborn because they assume, here's that question begging problem again, they assume the unborn aren't human. Nobody argues for privacy or forcing one's religion if we're talking about a law that says you can't kill 5-year-olds. But they do argue that way about a law that says you can't kill a human fetus. Why? Because they're assuming the unborn are not human. So the issue is only complex psychologically. It's not complex morally if we simply ask ourselves, would this be a good reason for killing a 2-year-old? Would anybody kill a 2-year-old because of economic hardship, because they can't go to college, because they can't have their life planned out the way they want it to plan out? Nobody would justify killing a 2-year-old for that reason, but they will kill a human fetus for that reason. Why? Because their complication of the issue is really not a true complication. It's a psychological complication, and they're confusing that with moral complexity.
It seems like there's just this presupposition under every single one of these pushbacks, most if not all, that they're basically assuming that it's not wrong. I mean, you have to almost assume that abortion is not that bad in order to bring any of these pushbacks. Because as you've mentioned, if we applied this to murdering a 5-year-old, none of these would hold. None of these arguments would hold if we just made the baby a little bit older or something like that. So that presupposition definitely seems, and even this last one here, that men can't speak on abortion, that is to me so bizarre. It's so bizarre to me, because if it was like, you could even see where people were coming from if men were the ones who were saying, hey, women shouldn't, paint their nails red or something. And I'd be like, okay, listen, dude, you don't get to tell me what color my nails are going to be. But we're talking about not your body, but somebody else who's living inside of your body. So how do you respond to that, especially since you are a man who's made, basically your main ministry here is providing pro-life apologetics?
Right. Well, the first thing I point out is that arguments don't have gender, people do. Pro-life women use the same exact argument I do. I mean, you've been making some of the same arguments I do. I have 3 staffers that work for me as speakers. They're all female. They all use the same exact arguments I do defending the pro-life view. So you have to address the argument. It's not enough to do what we call an ad hominem attack, which is ultimately fallacious because you're attacking the person, not the actual argument that's being advanced. So that's the first problem. The second problem is this: if no man can speak on abortion, we should have reversed Roe v. Wade on day one because it was decided by 9 men. I think what this argument is really saying is that only men who support abortion have a voice in this. So they're really not even being honest about what their real argument is. Arguments stand or fall apart from those making them. People do this, as you know, Alisa, with Christianity all the time. They'll say, how can Christianity be true when people have done awful things in the name of religion? I mean, think of a guy like Christopher Hitchens, the late atheist apologist, who in his book, God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. Boy, you get a catalog of everything done evil in the name of religion. But his real purpose is to show that Christianity is false. But notice he doesn't do anything to refute the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth. He attacks individual believers. Well, that's not going to get the job done, and it won't do to get the pro-life argument refuted by simply attacking someone because of their gender. That's an ad hominem, fallacious way to argue.
Well, as we close out here, what would you like to leave everybody with? If you just had a couple moments to inspire the average Christian who's listening to this to speak up a little more, or maybe get a little braver in letting your views be known, what would you want to leave us with today as a point of encouragement or inspiration?
I believe the Supreme Court is going to reverse Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood versus Casey. Of course, I could be wrong. So, you might have me back in a month or two and, I've got to eat some crow, but most likely it will. That will not mean pro-lifers have won. It means we now can fight fairly. We're no longer handcuffed by the federal courts. When that happens, Alisa, all of us are now pro-life apologists. The days of believing that we can leave this debate to those who professionally do it. No, we all have to know how to defend our pro-life view in a minute or less. And here's how you do that. I'm going to actually tell your viewers how to defend it in a minute or less. But before I do that, I want to tell politicians how to defend their pro-life view in 7 seconds or less, because on the evening news, that's all you get. Okay, if I'm a politician and they shove the mic in my face and say, why are you pro-life? Here's my answer. I am pro-life because it's wrong to intentionally kill innocent human beings. Stop, rinse, repeat 1,000 times. Keep saying it, and you will be on message. You will be communicating the moral logic of the pro-life view, and you will be clear. For the rest of us, we probably do have a minute to explain to somebody on an airplane or maybe over the Thanksgiving table. So let's say your Aunt Betty visits you. Alisa, I don't know that you have an Aunt Betty, I'm making this up, visits you at Thanksgiving, and between bites of turkey and stuffing, she looks at you and says, now, why are you pro-life? I can't believe someone as intelligent as you would be against abortion. Why are you pro-life? Here is your answer in a minute or less. And you can time me to see if I get this done if you want. Aunt Betty, I'm pro-life because it's wrong to intentionally kill innocent human beings. And the science of embryology is clear that from the earliest stages of development, from the one cell stage, you were a distinct, living, and whole human being. You weren't part of another human being like skin cells on the back of my hand. You were already a whole living member of the human family, even though you had yet to grow and mature. And you know what else, Aunt Betty? There's no essential difference between you, the embryo, and you, the adult, that would justify killing you back then. Differences of size, level of development, environment, and degree of dependency are not good reasons for saying you could be killed then, but not now. Now, I'm going to guess I got that done in under a minute.
I think it was, yeah.
How many Bible verses did I cite?
None.
But did I communicate biblical truth?
I have a feeling that...
this is what we have to know how to do, Alisa.
Yeah,
we have
I have a feeling
know how to communicate and make our case.
I know that most people who just heard that are probably going to type that out. They're going to memorize that because the way you just communicated that is exactly how you would want to be able to communicate it without feeling like, because I think that's the thing, you get in the, Thanksgiving or this or that, and you start to kind of apologize for what you believe, but if you're prepared, and this is what I want to urge everybody who's listening to this or watching this, type that out. Maybe we'll type it out and we'll put it on somewhere in the show note links or
I'll send
or
it to you. In fact, I don't know your rules on what you post and don't. It's your choice, but I will send you that 1 minute soundbite along with a summary and defense of the pro-life argument I made that you're welcome to post on your site.
Well, we'll do that. We'll post that, and then we'll post a link so people can go right to that. But I would encourage everybody listening and watching, go ahead and memorize that. Get ready for the Thanksgiving dinner. And I want to thank my guest, Scott Klusendorf, for joining me today. What an absolutely informative, insightful, thorough conversation on pro-life arguments. I want to encourage everybody, if you're watching on audio platforms, if you're listening on audio platforms like Google, Spotify, iTunes, leave us a 5-star review, and that really helps with the algorithm to get this into the news feeds of more people. Also, please share this episode with friends and family who might just feel like, I need language for this topic. I need to know how to talk to my friends about this. If you want access to some bonus content and some exclusive content, you can go to patreon.com/Alisa Childers. But thank you so much for listening and watching this week, and we will see you next time.